All right, folks, on this episode of the Supplement Lab, I'm not going to pull a fast one on you. We're going to talk about all the different ways of boosting nitric oxide here with plasma caps on this episode of the Supplement Lab. All right, so obviously there's going to be more than one way to skin the nitric oxide cat, and there's even more ways to actually decrease blood pressure and promote more vasodilation. So here we're going to show you the difference here, the similarities, the overlap, and the non-overlap between Plasma Surge and Plasma Caps. Now, a lot of you people who have tried Plasma Surge already understand, based off of taking it from the last video that I did on Plasma Surge, that this is something that is strictly nitric oxide synthase dependent, which means it uses things like arginine, citrulline, ornithine, and that typical wheelhouse of producing nitric oxide, since those different amino acids can get interconverted into one another, even though ornithine has more of a profound impact on the urea cycle, thus decreasing blood urea nitrogen levels and increasing nitrogen retention. However, it does have some supporting activity with the use of N-acetylcysteine. This promotes more formation of S-nitrosoglutathione, another way of storing nitric oxide, but it also has a smaller dose of vasodrive AP, only at 100 milligrams here. But when you compare that with what we have here in Plasma Caps, Plasma Caps, for the most part, is nitric oxide synthase independent. It utilizes nitrates and things that, more fortify nitrate activity. And it also has anthocyanidins, which are particularly bad tasting. You can't put pine bark and stuff inside a Plasma Surge or it's going to taste kind of gross. So we put those bad tasting things in here in the cap, and we also have twice the amount of vasodrive that's actually found here in Plasma Surge, which is kind of nice. The other kind of nice thing is that we put estrogen in the caps, which does have an impact on amino acid absorption, so that potentially could make the combination of Plasma Caps and Plasma Surge more effective. Anyway, so if you do combine these two, you have a combination of two different pathways, both nitric oxide synthase dependent and nitric oxide synthase independent pathways, where you're actually using both methods of forming nitric oxide. Now, the caps, like I said earlier, will definitely make the Plasma Surge more potent, and the higher vasodrive dose overall actually has you at 300 milligrams, which is a little more than 50% of what's already in clinical studies, but I'll get to that in a bit. So, if you want to quantify this somewhat at home, there are different ways that you can do this. One of which is you can go on Amazon and you can get these Salivary nitric oxide test strips. Basically, they have a 3-tier scale of you don't got any, you got some, and then you got a lot. So it's not that accurate, but it is a really good way of having a yes or no way to finding out if you're increasing your nitric oxide levels. Second way of doing this is by going to like your local pharmacy, CVS, Walgreens, what have you, and getting a blood pressure cuff. This one's nice. It's wireless aside from the actual blood pressure cuff part. It runs on batteries, and you can get an answer to, am I experiencing any decrease in blood pressure or vasodilation within a few minutes? So, into how this product actually works. Now, when we're talking about nitrates, here in Plasma Caps we're using something called betaine nitrate. Nitrates on their own, for the most part, they come from plants. Why? A couple of different reasons. They're involved in something that's part of the nitrogen cycle. The plants actually fix nitrogen and store it for themselves. Nitrates are also used as a component in a lot of different plant fertilizers, so they're used on a massive agricultural scale. In addition to this, you can also make nitrates and nitrites endogenously, and you can actually oxidize nitric oxide to form nitrite or into nitrate from your own enzymes inside your body. In addition to this, nitrates, for the most part, we all see beetroot in a lot of different products, and that's because beets actually have the highest concentration of nitrates comparatively to any other type of vegetable source of nitrates that exists in the world. However, it is also found in decent concentrations in spinach, and this leads to, the whole thing of why Popeye the Sailor Man could suddenly eat spinach, get a really nice sick pump, and beat up Bluto and save olive oil. The whole thing, it was done, God, I don't even know how long ago Popeye existed, to be real. I have watched it, that does date me some, but that idea existed long before the use of nitrates for enhancing performance. So back into this, so that's surface level stuff. If you want to test it at home, you can. You understand the differences and the similarities between these two products. Now let's get into the mechanisms. Betaine nitrate. Let's consider just the betaine on its own. This is something that's an osmolytic. We've discussed this in the slice video, and it does end up pairing well with the glycerol monosterate that's also found in plasma caps. So it does have a positive hydration effect in that sense. Now, actual nitrate and how nitrate gets used. Now, it's a very, very interesting kind of mechanism because human beings, for the most part, don't have enzymes that are capable of reducing it, at least not under normal circumstances. What usually does happen, and especially consider that these are also in DR capsules, so it does take that 1 hour of gastric transit time for the ingredients to deploy. But there's more. Once these ingredients do deploy in the small intestine, nitrate specifically has pretty darn close to a 100% absorption rate, which is kind of puzzling considering that we don't have the enzyme that's required for the breakdown into nitrite and so on and so forth. But what it does do is that absorption occurs here in the small intestine. The body recognizes this and it pumps it up to the salivary glands, where it will end up pumping nitrate into your actual salivary tissue where a bunch of bacteria live, and these bacteria are called facultative anaerobes, which means they can live in normal oxygen environments, they can live in low oxygen environments, and they're capable of reducing nitrate into nitrite, which they do pretty easily. And they do this because they're able to use it in their energy production processes as an alternate electron acceptor. And this is important, but I'll get to why it's important here in a minute. So you swallow it, the pill gets deployed in the intestine, the nitrate gets pumped back to the salivary glands, the conversion of nitrate into nitrite occurs, and you swallow it again. Now, when you swallow nitrite, it can mix with stomach acid to form nitrous acid, which is something that can also get reduced to nitric oxide pretty easily. Or if you just have nitrite that gets swallowed into your guts and you've also taken any kind of antioxidants, I don't know, like 3 of the other ingredients that are in here, that those antioxidants can have an antioxidative effect, and they can also facilitate the reduction from nitrite into nitric oxide. So there's typically a school of thought that pre-existed a lot of this kind of study, thinking that this whole system, this nitric oxide synthase independent mechanism, was reserved for hypoxic conditions. So if you were at altitude, the body would compensate. And it does this actually in a few different populations that live up close to the Himalayas, where they naturally have higher nitrate levels circulating in their blood. And it's just part of the adaptive process to being at these high altitudes with lower oxygen. The second thing is anaerobic exercise. If you're doing a bunch of heavy weightlifting and you're breathing real hard and heavy, and if you're pushing on a bench or a squat and you're holding your breath as you do it, you're creating an acute hypoxic condition, and the body will compensate for this by increasing nitrate, nitrite, and nitric oxide levels. The third thing is suffocation. You ever seen a movie where somebody's suffocating? I'm not talking like a bag over your head, but I'm talking like hands around the neck kind of thing, where the jugular veins become very much dilated, and they're trying to, as hard as they can, feed oxygen and any kind of electron acceptors to the brain in order to enhance its survival. So this leads us into an interesting realm where I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to throw a speculation out here that nitric oxide synthase independent production of nitric oxide, this is the whole nitrate-based mechanism of producing NO, it's not a backup for these hypoxic conditions. And in fact, I actually think that this is a preferred mode of operation where the body is actually trying to make more energy more effectively and more efficiently, and it actually causes a decrease in reactive oxygen species. So these reactive oxygen species that are typically produced under normoxic conditions like superoxide or peroxide radicals are not going to be formed whenever you have this nitrate thing that's taking the place of oxygen in the electron transport chain. And this is evidenced by 3 different things, some of which I just talked about. One is the fact that the salivary bacteria will actually use nitrate, even when it's got plenty of oxygen all the time, to use nitrate as an alternate electron receptor, reduce that, and form nitrite. It does this under the influence of normal oxygen conditions, which is compelling. So it'll still make this conversion even though there's oxygen present. My second point, it also turns out that the mitochondria share this affinity for nitrate as an alternate electron acceptor. The mitochondria can actually use this, produce energy, and it doesn't have as many drawbacks as breathing normal oxygen and functioning like that. The third thing, This actually happens in human beings. And it's evidenced by a lot of the different studies that mention how nitrate supplementation can actually decrease VO2 max, but increase power output, which is a paradoxical thing in the first place, because usually whenever you're doing some sort of study with endurance, you actually want to see an increase in VO2 max. You want to be able to shove more oxygen into the body. But what this does is it also has a negative effect. You produce lactic acid as some sort of a downstream byproduct of all this respiration going on. But when you supplement with nitrates, this increase in mitochondrial efficiency increases ATP, but it does so without producing the extra lactic acid, which is also kind of interesting. So we have an alternate electron acceptor that decreases oxygen consumption and doesn't cause an increase in lactic acid, which is pretty compelling, and that's why nitrates are so cool. Getting into the next ingredient that we have here is actually propionyl L-carnitine that I'm going to discuss. Now, a lot of the studies previously on supplements of this nature use a amino acid salt derivative called glycine propionyl L-carnitine. There's a variation of different dosages on that from 1 to 4.5 grams. We have a supplemental dose of 250 milligrams, which ain't bad considering that propionyl L-carnitine is different from L-carnitine, and it's also different from acetylcarnitine. And if you wanted to put one carbon on carnitine, that would be methylcarnitine. When you have acetylcarnitine, that's a 2-carbon move, or you could have an ethyl if you're going to be counting in that kind of way. The third carbon is called propionyl. Now, 3 carbons on propionyl carnitine, it has a lot of different interesting effects. It actually has the highest affinity for carnitine palmitoyl transferase, which is talked about in thermal and slice. This is the enzyme that actually gets carnitine with the fats to shuttle them into the inner mitochondrial matrix. But turns out propionyl carnitine actually wins that race. But the other thing that's really neat about propionyl carnitine is that it has a unique vasodilatory effect that none of the other carnitines possess. So you got regular L-carnitine, fatty acid transporter, you got acetyl L-carnitine, which can be involved in the choline pathways and all that kind of stuff. And then you got propionyl carnitine, which has to do with blood flow, which is kind of puzzling because you got 3 different carnitines. You would think that they would have 3 shared jobs, but instead they have 3 completely separate jobs. So the actual mechanism is unknown when it comes to PLC. No one really knows why this strange 3-carbon fatty-ish add-on carnitine is going to have any impact on nitric oxide levels. But what we do know is that regular aerobic exercise on its own can increase nitric oxide levels approximately 10%, which is okay, cool. I work out and I get better blood flow. Great. Now, if you're a chronic exerciser, like if you've got any friends out there that are like marathon runners and they run all the time and then they've got like great vascularity and everything, especially like in their legs and their quads and their calves, that's because it increases nitrate and nitrite levels consistently over time. So if you're a chronic exerciser, you're going to have lower blood pressure and better blood flow because you've got more of this stuff kind of systemically like circulating in your body. Now, the combination of GPLC and exercise that was used in this study caused a more significant increase in NOx levels, which would be nitrate, nitrite, or nitric oxide, all in additively together. And what this does is it causes approximately 16 to 17% increase over thresholds. Like I said, exercise was approximately 10, but in this particular study, the control group only had like a 4 to 6% increase in nitric oxide levels over normal placebo thresholds. So to have like a 4 times higher effect is potentially a great thing, or 3 times on the low end of the spectrum. But another thing that propionyl carnitine does is it increases endothelial nitric oxide synthase levels. So this is back on the nitric oxide synthase dependent side, where increasing these levels can actually make the things that are in plasma surge work a little bit better. So like I said earlier, this does increase anaerobic work capacity, which can be also kind of puzzling. It also decreases lactic acid production by 22.8%. So as we said with nitrates, it doesn't produce any extra lactic acid, but here with propionyl carnitine, we notice a 22.8% reduction in lactic acid producing capability. Now, there's a couple different ways that this could be happening. One is that it could be facilitating the nitrites and nitrates like we discussed earlier, and it goes along with the same story. So in that sense, the propionyl L-carnitine could support nitrate supplementation. The other thing is, it could just be restoring intramuscular carnitine levels like I talked about in the last video of thermal, and that could have a potential benefit on decreasing lactic acid over time. It's interesting. But, you know, I like this combination because this is something that's pretty nitrate specific and nitrates themselves, so these two will end up working together. Next, going down the list, we have a combination of 3 different kinds of things. One is Hawthorne Berry. The second thing is grapeseed extract, standardized for 50% resveratrol. Third thing is pine bark, and that's standardized for 95% anthocyanidins. And I talked a little bit about in super greens when I talked about beta berries, the fact that there's different berries that have variations in color, and the darker you get, the more anthocyanidins are there. And this is also true for various pine barks because these pine barks have a reddish color to them, and you can kind of actually see it in the capsules. Another thing you'll notice possibly in the capsules is a little bit of flex. That's because the propionyl carnitine can, in some cases, liquefy if it's humid, or if the ambient humidity is significant enough to cause that to happen. So those little dots you see are the anthocyanidins that have come into contact with that liquid carnitine kind of stuff. But what do these 3 things do? So the commons between hawthorn and resveratrol and pine bark extract is the anthocyanidin source, which is kind of interesting because we do know that they do have an impact on decreasing oxidative stress. Anything in the world is an antioxidant. I mean, it's like saying that wood burns, you know. Yeah, you can put a log of wood on the fire and it's an antioxidant because it's suiciding itself into oblivion by donating itself to being burned, sure. But another thing that these anthocyanidins do is they have a significant impact on the ability to increase nitric oxide synthase expression. So if you have more of this enzyme, then you've got a higher ability to produce more nitric oxide, which is cool. Another thing about hawthorn is something that's been used actually for centuries for various cardiovascular conditions, if you will. But it's also something that has one of the highest naturally occurring abundances of nitrate reductase. So there's a plant form of nitrate reductase, not just the one that lives inside the bacteria in your mouth, but plants can also reduce nitrate as well. And that's why we've chosen this hawthorn to be used in conjunction with this whole nitric oxide synthase independent pathway. Grapeseed and resveratrol, like I said, it was another antioxidant kind of thing. I'll skip over that, but the other thing I wanted to point out was about pine bark extract and how pine bark extract has actually been investigated in several different studies for chronic venous insufficiency. Now, that has to do not so much with your main arteries and veins as far as your blood flow is concerned, but the really, really, really tiny small capillaries and increasing blood flow and vasodilation there. And this is something that, you know, is just like niacin, number 1 on this list. And we all know from the flush that flush doesn't lie. That is definitely some vasodilation going on, and especially in the skin, where it actually causes a 100% increase in cutaneous perfusion or blood flow to the skin. But it's also been said that, you know, there's several different ways that this could happen. There's several different ways that blood pressure can decrease under the influence of niacin, and most pharmaceutical niacin that you'll get in other countries, because here it's a supplement, will actually have an insert that says, you know, be aware that this can cause an acute drop in blood pressure. So, you know, don't stand up too fast or whatever it is that could possibly have you pass out. And this can happen from several different mechanisms. One of which is the fact that niacin clears out triglycerides. And it is said, based off of another study that I read, that a single 500 milligram dose of niacin can clear the entire plasma of triglycerides. I wouldn't say entire, but it can clear significantly triglycerides from the plasma in a matter of minutes. This is a water-soluble B vitamin that happens to travel very quickly. So if you do take it in a supplemental form and you do feel that flush, that's already happening. And you know it's only minutes, especially if you take an instant release form of niacin that's going to deploy inside the stomach, that you are on your way to a full flush well within half an hour of taking it. So it does work very quickly, and it doesn't shock me to hear that triglycerides can diminish from the plasma that fast. Another possibility is it works on the HDL and LDL ratio. And a little bit in Cheat, I talked about how excessive LDL cholesterol can decrease plasma membrane fluidity and can kind of make things tough. And another way of looking at this is saying if you have too much LDL cholesterol, that it hardens the arteries. You've probably heard that before. But to have a higher HDL to LDL ratio is something that can actually make things more fluid and can actually make it more viable in the endothelial cells, where more endothelial nitric oxide synthase can actually be present and do its job. Another statistic from niacin is that aside from the 100% increase in cutaneous perfusion, that it causes a 200% increase in blood skeletal muscle perfusion. And that's particularly applicable here because that's where we want the blood flow to go. We want it to go to your muscles and not so much the skin. So even though we're kind of using the niacin to kind of hitch a ride on extra vasodilation, and we do get the effect of the flush, we're still trying to maintain good blood flow to the muscles. Last thing that we're going to talk about is vasodrive AP. Vasodrive AP is pretty interesting because it has a unique mechanism that's not nitric oxide based, but it is vasodilation based because it does diminish blood pressure. These compounds are two tripeptides, which are isoprolylproline or isoleucylprolylproline and valylprolylproline, and both of these were originally discovered in fermented milk. And which is really kind of nice that we have it here in a pill, because I wouldn't personally want to drink a bunch of fermented milk. And I'm sure you wouldn't either, because that's going to taste bad. So anyway, vasodrive AP actually has a particular mechanism at inhibiting an enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme, which converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, the more active form. And if you can guess from the sound of the name of that particular peptide, angio being your vasculature, your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries, tensing it up, you kind of want to stop that guy, because this is definitely going to kill your pump and it's going to make it less efficacious. So by inhibiting angiotensin converting enzyme, it can actually cause a significant decrease in actual blood pressure. Now, one of the things that I noticed, that if you look at the combination between Plasma Surge and Plasma Caps, you get 100 milligrams over here. You get 200 milligrams of vasodrive AP over here for a combined total of 300 milligrams of vasodrive AP. As far as the clinically substantiated dose, this gets you a little bit more than 50% of the way there. However, I've looked at several different studies regarding this material, even in hypertensive patients, where they were using well under 100 milligrams. So I feel like a 300 milligram dose should be pretty sufficient, even on top of all the other stuff that's going on, to produce a pretty solid pump. So that's it. That's Plasma Caps with Plasma Surge. Plasma Surge is good on its own, but if you take the Plasma Caps, it makes the Plasma Surge work even better. Or even if you don't want to take the Plasma Surge, maybe you want to take some sort of other pump products, Plasma Caps might be able to enhance that as well. So this has been Blood Flow, nitric oxide dependent and independent pathways on the Supplement Lab. We'll see you next time.